I'm from Sugar Spun Run, and today we are taking the nostalgic ding dong treat and turning it into a cake. Despite the fact that ding dong is an incredibly silly name and I kind of even feel weird saying it on camera, I thought this cake was absolutely worth sharing with you today. Everyone who has tried it has absolutely loved it. I think it's going to be my birthday cake this year, probably going to make it for all of the kids. Just has a great flavor and great texture. So let's get right to it. Today's recipe actually starts on the stovetop where we're going to be making the base for our filling. This is going to be that vanilla cream layer that goes between our cake layers. I am going to be using my ermine frosting recipe today. It's silky, smooth, not too sweet, and it perfectly emulates that cream filling inside of a ding dong. How many times am I gonna have to say ding dong today? We will see. So in a medium-sized saucepan, you're going to combine 1 cup of granulated sugar with 5 tablespoons of all-purpose flour, and just 1/4 teaspoon of table salt. Now we'll whisk these ingredients together until they're nicely combined. You want to make sure there are no lumps in your flour, get everything nicely distributed. Next, you'll need a cup of milk. I'm using whole milk today, and I am going to gradually drizzle this in while I'm whisking the dry ingredients. Dry ingredients and sugar. Sugar's technically not a dry ingredient, but you know what I mean. Whisking this in gradually. And one thing I'm just trying to be conscious of is that I don't want any lumps. Pause for just a second, because we have some flour hiding in the sides of our pot. There we go. All right, now we're going to turn our stovetop heat to medium, and we are going to whisk this while it's cooking, and we're going to whisk it pretty much constantly until it begins to thicken and reaches a pudding-like consistency. You'll know it's done because first it will reach that consistency. If you were to dip a spoon in it, it would coat the back of the spoon, and your whisk should be leaving trails in the pot as well. I'll show you what it looks like. So this frosting that we're making is going to be sandwiched between 2 chocolate cake layers. And as I mentioned, this is an ermine frosting we're making. I've shared this recipe, I've made videos of it before, it's on the blog. This is the frosting that I use in my whoopie pies. It is used on my red velvet cake. It is also what I use inside my Swiss roll. It's great because it has such a nice texture and it's not too sweet, and it had just the right feel for the ding dong cake we were making today. So I always like to make the base for the filling first because it's going to take a while for it to cool. So if we make it now, it can sit at room temperature and it can cool while our cakes are baking and while our cakes are cooling. So it's been a couple minutes. You can see it's starting to thicken. It's starting to bubble as well, which is also a good sign that it's just about finished. So you can see my whisk is leaving trails. I don't want to let this cook too long, but I want to show you what I'm talking about. See, the back of the spoon is coated. It's a good sign it's done. So we're going to pop this right off the stove. Keep whisking it because the last thing you want is for this to burn. And it's going to keep cooking a little bit even when you remove it from the stovetop. All right, give you another look at this. You can see it's thickened, has a pudding-like consistency. My whisk is leaving trails. It's beautiful, it's done. We are going to pour it into a heat-proof container now. Once you have this in a heat-proof container, I like to take a piece of wax paper and I'm just going to gently ball it up first. I'm going to press it against the surface of our frosting base. Crinkling this makes it a lot more cooperative. I should say our filling base. Technically this is a frosting, but we're using it as a filling, so. All right, I have that pressed up against the surface. I'm going to leave this at room temperature because I will want it to be room temperature and not cold when I go to use it. And now we can start prepping our cake layers. First things first, get your oven preheating to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. For today's recipe, we're going to be baking our cake into 2 layers. I recommend using 8-inch cake pans. Lightly grease them with baking spray or with shortening and flour. And I highly recommend lining the bottoms of the cake pans with a round of parchment paper, which is just going to be your guarantee that the cakes won't stick. Now in a large mixing bowl, let's combine 1 3/4 cup of all-purpose flour with 1 cup of firmly packed light brown sugar, as well as a cup of granulated sugar, 3/4 cup of natural cocoa powder, 1 1/2 teaspoons of baking soda, and 3/4 teaspoon of table salt. Now we'll whisk all of these ingredients together until everything is nicely combined. Break up that brown sugar so it's well distributed. Break up your cocoa powder so there are no lumps in it. It's okay if you see a few lumps. We just want to give the batter a nice head start before we start adding some of our more liquid ingredients to it. All right, the next thing you're going to need is 1/2 cup of melted unsalted butter. We're not exactly doing the reverse creaming method here, but obviously we're not doing traditional creaming either. I love this hybrid method because it's going to give us a super moist cake, and it's very difficult to accidentally overmix this cake, which can happen with traditional creaming. So I'm going to add the butter. We're also going to add some cooking oil as well. You can use canola oil or vegetable oil, but personally I have not been using seed oils recently, so I'm using avocado oil. Olive oil I wouldn't recommend as much because you can kind of get some of that olive oil flavor, and we just don't really want that in today's cake. Now I like using both butter and oil because you're going to get the best of both worlds here. You get the nice buttery flavor, but you get all of the moisture from oil. Since this cake is best kept refrigerated thanks to the filling, I wanted to safeguard it against the refrigerator. Fridges dry out cakes. Adding oil is going to prevent it from getting too dry. This is a 1/2 cup of oil. Just like we don't waste butter, we want to get all of that oil in there. Now you could mix everything together by hand, but the dough is going to be a little bit stiff, so I like to use my electric hand mixer for this step. Alternatively, you could use a stand mixer. Now we'll go ahead and stir this together until all of the dry ingredients are moistened by this butter and oil that we have here. Now, if this cake seems familiar to you, that's because it is my chocolate cake layers. They worked perfectly for today's cake. There were no serious alterations that needed to be made. It's just such a good, flavorful cake, and it worked great here. All right, the next thing we're going to need is some eggs. We are going to be adding 2 eggs plus 1 egg yolk to today's cake batter. These should be a room temperature. If you use cold eggs straight from the fridge, what can happen is your batter can sort of seize up and you want a nice uniform batter. So let me add the 2 eggs first. And then we'll get our egg yolk out of here by just passing that yolk back and forth, letting the egg white drop out. Add that into our batter. And we're also going to add 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract and stir everything together until it's nice and uniform. Always a good idea to periodically scrape the sides and bottom of the bowl to make sure your ingredients are getting well combined and you don't have anything hiding on the sides or bottom that isn't combined. This is especially true if you're using your stand mixer, because I find that I tend to get like pockets there right on the bottom. If you know where that little ridge is at the bottom, always tend to get pockets of some kind of ingredient there. All right, next we are going to be adding 1 cup of buttermilk, and this ideally should be a room temperature, or at least not straight from the fridge as well. Now we'll gradually add this. Quick scrape of the sides and bottom of the bowl. We don't want any streaky bits of batter in there. And the last ingredient we're going to be adding today is a 1/2 cup of hot coffee. Now, if you don't want to use hot coffee, just use hot water instead, but it is important that the water be steaming hot. This is going to help bloom the cocoa, and it's going to give your cake a really nice flavor. Now, I actually don't keep coffee in the house. We don't really drink it, so I make instant coffee. You grab that water. All right, nice hot cup of coffee. Set that out of the way. We're going to drizzle this in with our mixer on low speed because you do not want to splatter yourself with your hot coffee or hot water. And the reason I like to use coffee instead of water is because the coffee won't make your cake taste like coffee or like mocha, but coffee is a really nice accent to chocolate and really brings out the chocolate flavors. So it's just a way to amp up the flavor of your chocolate cake. And you can see we have a pretty thin batter here. That's normal. And for the last time, I'm going to tell you to scrape the sides and bottom of your bowl because you really do want to make sure this is nice and uniform. I'm gonna splatter a little bit on my counter, that's fine. But if you don't have a uniform batter, then when you bake your cakes, they're not going to bake evenly. They may even cave in the centers, even if they are baked enough. So this looks nice, silky, smooth. So now we will grab our cake pans that we prepped just a little bit ago. These are dripping everywhere, let me get rid of them. All right, and let's divide our batter into our pans. All right, no cake batter left behind, primarily because I'll eat it if it's left behind. Now we'll take these over to our preheated oven. You're going to want to bake them in the center rack, and they'll need to bake for about 33 to 35 minutes. You'll know they're finished baking when a toothpick inserted in the center comes out clean or with a few moist fudgy crumbs. Now, I always prefer my cakes to have moist fudgy crumbs as a sign that they're done. It shouldn't be wet batter, but fudgy crumbs are great. If the toothpick comes out completely dry, that's fine too, but you are more at risk of accidentally over baking your cake if the toothpick is completely clean. Now we're going to let these cool in the cake pans for about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll run a knife along the edges and carefully invert them onto a cooling rack to cool completely before we decorate them. Gotta love that parchment paper insurance right there. Just don't forget to remove it. Now we'll let these cool completely before we decorate our cakes. All right, while our cakes are cooling, I am going to start preparing the ganache. Now there are a couple of things I want you to keep in mind before you start preparing your own ganache. This is going to be the icing on the cake. We're going to spread it on the cake, not pour it on. So you're going to make the ganache, let it cool a bit until it's spreadable and not just dripping off of your spatula. However, you don't want to let it sit so long that it's super thick and difficult to spread. It's a little bit hard to come back from that. So just keep in mind you want to time it properly so that your cakes are ready to go and your ganache is spreadable at the same time. Exactly how long it needs to sit is going to vary. I feel like mine typically sits for like 15 to 20 minutes, but that will vary depending on exactly how hot your chocolate gets and the temperature of your kitchen and the weather outside and whether you've agreed to sacrifice your firstborn. So there are just many factors. So I'm kind of doing a cheater's ganache today. I have 8 ounces of chocolate. I'm using Couverture chocolate, but if you don't have that, just chop up a semi-sweet or 60% baking bar and cut that into fine pieces. I'm going to add 1 cup of heavy cream, pour this evenly over the chocolate, and then I'm going to pop this in the microwave for 35 seconds. I'm going to give this a quick whisk. It's not going to be totally melted, but it's going to start to melt. Pop it back in the microwave for another 25 seconds. We'll do another whisk. And if needed, return it to the microwave for another 20 to 25 seconds until your chocolate is completely melted and your mixture is smooth. All right, beautiful, nice and smooth. We'll set this aside to cool a bit and we'll make our filling. Now I have my frosting base from earlier, this pudding-like mixture. Keep this handy, and in a large mixing bowl, mine could probably be larger, but we'll make this work, we're going to add 1 cup of softened unsalted butter. Now, again, you could do this in a stand mixer with a whisk attachment or paddle attachment, but I'm going to be using my hand mixer, and I'm going to beat the butter until it is light and creamy. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is room temperature, or at least it's close to room temperature. It can still be slightly cooler. The frosting base we're going to be using should be the same. It should neither be too warm nor too cold. If it's the same temperature as the butter, it's going to combine so much more easily. Now, let me remove my wax paper and any of the base stuck to that because I don't want to lose any of this. And I keep saying frosting base, but really we're using this as a filling. So it's the base for our filling. So now we'll gradually add this base to our butter mixture. I'm just gonna do this a spoonful at a time, or like a heaping spoonful at a time. You don't wanna add too much at once or the mixture could end up curdling or separating. So let's get the first one mixed in. And don't add another spoonful until the previous one is completely combined. All right, let's add this last bit. Stir this in. All right, once everything is combined, we will scrape the sides and bottom of the bowl at the risk of sounding like a broken record. We're going to add vanilla extract. You're going to need a teaspoon of vanilla, and I actually like to use clear vanilla here because it's going to keep the frosting a more pure white color, and also it has a taste that lends itself towards the taste of a ding dong. All right, let's start by stirring this in on low speed, and we're going to gradually increase our mixer to high, and we're going to whip this until it is smooth and airy. All right, now I like to use my spatula just to deflate the frosting if I've worked too much air into it. You can see a lot of air bubbles. So we're just going to gently deflate the icing. And then this is a pretty soft and silky frosting. So because I don't want it to just spill out of my cake layers when I add that top layer, I'm going to put it in the fridge to chill for about 15 minutes or so before I actually apply it to my cake and start assembly. While the filling is in the fridge, I usually like to level my cakes. This is just going to ensure I have a nice level cake. Now I use this super easy tool. I will try to remember to link to it in the description just because it's like $7 and I've absolutely gotten my money's worth out of it. What I'm doing here could absolutely be done with a sharp knife instead, but I'm really bad at holding the knife level and my cakes usually end up worse. Then as a bonus, after you've leveled your cakes, cake scraps. This is the best part. All right, back to business. All right, let's go ahead and assemble our cake layers now. We'll start with one layer on the bottom of our cake platter. And now for our filling, our ermine frosting. All of this is going to go in the center. So let's go ahead, drop that right on. And it is a lot of filling. So we're going to smooth this as much as we can to the edges. It's okay if a little bit goes off the edges as well. I'm going to switch over to an icing spatula and do a nice smooth layer. And this is going to seem like a ton of filling, and it is, but remember there is no frosting around the cake. We have a ganache, but there's no other frosting than this right here. All right, once this is pretty level, I think we're pretty level, you'll notice I have some spilling a little bit over the edges. That's fine, I'll show you what we'll do with that in a second. We'll take our next cake layer. We're going to place this on top, getting it centered as much as possible. I'm going to gently press down on it. And now anything that's spilling over, I'm going to smooth around the edges of the cake. So just take my spatula, try not to block the camera with my head, but I have to see what I'm doing. So once I have this smoothed around the cake, I like to pop this in the freezer for at least 10 or 15 minutes before I add the ganache topping. After a brief stint in the fridge, we can add our ganache frosting. So let me just show you how the ganache looks over here. You can see it's thickened up quite a bit. I'm going to add this right on top of my cake. And I haven't used quite all of it. I have a little bit left in the bowl. And I am just going to smooth this over the cake. So you can see how it's important for the ganache to not be too soft or it'll just spill all over and it'll be kind of messy. I always start on top. It's still pretty soft, and then I nudge it over the edges, and then I gently work this around the cake. And because we had this in the freezer for a little bit, that ermine frosting will stay snug against the cake and it won't make a mess with the ganache. I'm doing this a little backwards. I want to make sure you can see it, but I also want to make sure I ice the cake properly. I'm going to grab the rest of my frosting. I didn't want to overdo it, or ganache. Didn't want to overdo it, but I want to make sure I have enough. I'll try to make this pretty smooth all around the edges. That way it looks like a ding dong. I think that looks pretty good. Anything messy on the cake platter can be cleaned up with a damp paper towel because I always make a mess. Maybe you're a little bit neater than I am. And now all that's left to do is pop this in the fridge for a little bit longer just so the ganache can firm up before we cut into it. All right, it took a lot of patience, but I did it. I popped this in the fridge for a little bit so the ganache is firmed up. And that's because I wanted you to see how much it looks like a real ding dong, but better, okay? You guys need to do this at home. Try the ding dong challenge. Try one of these compared to this cake and tell me which one you like better. Okay, here we go, moment of truth. Ta-da! Looks like we left some frosting behind. That won't do. Glue that right on there. All right, that is how you make a ding dong cake. You guys, I don't even like saying ding dong, but I did it for you because I really think you need to try this cake. It's fun, it's nostalgic, it's amazing. And if you try it at home, please leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. I really do always love hearing from you. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. All right, this is the best part. I would marry this cake. Like, it's so good. It's my birthday cake. Should have been my wedding cake. All right, I won't insult the ding dong. Let me try it again. Today's recipe actually take a shot every time I say ding dong? Yes. I would die. If you use cold eggs, oops, it's amazing I'm able to work under these conditions. How much it looks, oh, Mrs. Ding Dong.